Izzy woke with a start. Click, bang, it was Edward Henley leaving for work. He was a tall, dark-haired man with an imposing stature. Large, kind brown eyes and skin, no matter how often washed, always seemed to be ingrained with the very dirt he helped to farm. She imagined him standing there in his large waterproof work coat, dirty worn trousers and huge scuffed black boots. The large wooden entrance door to the house had swollen in the wet weather, and Izzy knew the sound perfectly well. She could imagine her father unlocking the door, clicking down the large latch using his thumb on the massive thumb plate, and while holding the handle, his 4 other fingers would be tugging at the door, persuading it to part from its frame, and so he could get outside and carry on to work. When the door eventually relented and opened, with a jolt it would allow in a gust of freezing wind to intrude upon the already cold internal air. This gust lifted a mirror which hung in the hallway just by the door, and bang! Down it came as soon as the gust had passed. "Bye, darling, have a good day," Izzy heard her mother say, and then the obligatory "Mwah!" Yuck, Izzy thought to herself. Why do parents have to be so embarrassing and kiss like that? It's disgusting. "Bye, Claire. I'll be home before lunch today, as we are only fixing broken fencing in the parks. I'll bring some firewood back with me, as it's going to be another cold one tonight." "OK, stay safe," returned her mother, and with that it was a reversal of noises. Bang, click, as the door was shut to. Another gust of air lifted the mirror, and then when the door was back in its frame, down came the clicking latch. Izzy attempted to roll over in bed. Not an easy thing to achieve, as it got so cold in the bedrooms during the winter, with them being above the stables of the coach house sooner than the bottom floor of the cottage where the fire was, that every blanket in the house was usually used to pin the occupants of the beds to their mattresses. The weight of the mountain of blankets made it very difficult to move at all, but also the act of moving sometimes let in the cold air, so it was usually best all round to stay as still as humanly possible. Slowly Izzy released a pyjamaed arm out through the top of the blankets and let her cold, naked hand search the floor to the side of her bed until it happened upon the object she was seeking, her mobile phone. She grabbed it up quickly and retreated her arm back to the safety and warmth of the blankets. Snuggling down again to a comfy pinned position under the covers, she looked at the screen of her phone. She wasn't checking for messages. There never was any point, as no one except her family usually sent her any. Her phone also doubled up as an alarm clock, and she knew that if her father had just left for work, then the alarm would start bellowing any time now, so best switch it off and not risk waking Jack. Looking at the screen, it showed 6:55 a.m. She'd heard him tapping away at his computer until late into the night, trying to keep up with all the gossip, and, being 15, Izzy knew that he liked a good lay-in at weekends if he could. "Bugger!" she exclaimed underneath her breath as the alarm sounded anyway. She switched it off and lay still, listening to see if she had disturbed anyone. From the lounge downstairs, Izzy could hear her mother sweeping out the fire grate, getting rid of the remaining embers so she could start afresh today and build another fire, so at least the lounge, kitchen and toilet would be warm for the rest of the day. This simple act of fire-making set Izzy thinking. As much as she loves her home, she knew that compared to Pamela's, Susan's and Carol's large farmhouses, hers was tiny in comparison. She tried at times not to compare her life to theirs, as how could she? They were all farmers' daughters, where she was a farm labourer's daughter. But in the unfairness that is her world, her mother and their mothers were always comparing the 4 of them. Susan got 95% on her SATs. Carol had achieved a grade 3 with her piano exams. Pamela always won cup after cup, rosette after rosette with her ponies. And Izzy, well, she was just mediocre. And she knew that about herself. She would never get the highest scores in class, but never the lowest either. Her parents could not afford piano lessons. They could barely afford to take her to the riding lesson at the local riding school once a month. So even though she did excel at riding, no one would ever see it, only her instructor. Izzy's home only had the one door, which she'd read somewhere was a fire hazard, but would never repeat that to her family. The door led to a tiny square hallway, To the left was a door to their only toilet, which doubled up as storage for wellies, shoes, coats, washing powder, hoover, and everything else that could not find a home anywhere else. The window to the toilet looked out to a patch of grass where Mr. Henley kept his car, and at the other side of the gravel track which led down to the gardener's cottage, the 6 wooden loose boxes, and far beyond that the farm. The door straight in front of the entrance led to the kitchen. It was a small but functional kitchen with a tiny table in the left-hand corner where she and Jack breakfasted every day before walking to catch their school bus. The kitchen window is opposite the door and looks out onto the lambing field where each spring all of the farm's orphan lambs are brought to be hand-reared, a job usually undertaken by Mrs. Henley as it's one of her regular roles upon the farm. To the right of the window and stretching down the full length of the lambing field is one of the long back walls making up the vault of the coach house stables. At the far side of the lambing field is a drive that leads up to the main road. The other side of the drive is screened by a huge 10-foot wall which marks the boundary of the grounds to Reddock Hall, and beyond the wall, rising out of the ground like a grand home people usually associate with the National Trust, was Reddock Hall itself. To the right of the entrance hall is a compact lounge and living area inside an old stone fireplace, and surround sits snugly against the left wall. Tucked into the corner of that is a solid door which separates the ground and first floors with stairs that very steeply ascend to the bedrooms above the stables. On the other side of the fireplace the stonework lowers and makes a shelf where the family have their television. Not a flat screen like what most families have, but a large bulky television set, not in the least modern but functional all the same. The room is light and airy, and most of the far wall is taken up with a large window which looks out onto their rear garden. Down the left side of the garden is a large imposing wall which makes up the other rear wall of the coach house. The garden is planted like a small orchard containing mainly apple trees, but with the odd lavender bush around its perimeter. The rear of the garden is protected by a huge boundary privet hedge, so large that Mr. Henley has to get his stepladders out every year to cut it, and beyond the hedge a small strip of woodland, only about 40 metres wide, known to all of the estate people as the pergola, and even though it contains some beautiful scented plants and the occasional trellis, its reason for being had long since been lost with time. It stretches from the main drive all the way in a straight line to the rear of the estate gardener, Mr. Elliott's house. Izzy was startled out of her daydream by the cracking and popping of the kindling her mother was using to start a fire down in the lounge. She stayed in bed imagining the old newspaper catching fire with bright orange and blue flames. As the fire set in, it would be flicking long fingers through the gaps in the kindling and up to the larger wood on top, and on top of that the shiny black lumps of coal. Within minutes Izzy could hear the flames roaring up the chimney. In her mind's eye she could picture her mother, sat on her heels, holding a spare piece of newspaper against the fire guard, drawing the air through the tower of wood and coal she'd created only moments earlier. Mrs. Henley was, or more reasonably put, had been a lady of great beauty. She was nothing like the rotund, bouncy, horsey mothers Izzy knew all of her friends had, who had homely figures to hug their children to. Claire Henley was about 5 feet 5 inches tall, with a very slender, somewhat elongated, graceful frame, not so unlike her daughters. She was always clean and tidy, and kept their cottage sparklingly clean. She was a stark contrast to Izzy's father, with his ordinary appearance and rugged bulk of a frame. Izzy sometimes wondered how they'd ever met, and fallen in love, with them being so very different to each other. Make an escape, and jumping into her slippers at the side of the bed, quickly grabbed out for a dressing gown which hung on the back of the door, racing down the steep stairs to the lounge to the warmth and security of the hungrily licking flames. "Kettle's just boiled," Claire Henley said to her daughter, even though she did not turn around from her job at the fireplace to look up. "Oh, okay," replied Izzy. "You want one?" "Yes, please." And with that Mrs. Henley turned and smiled. Izzy's heart melted. Why had she been so horrible last night? She gulped the thought away and went to the kitchen to make them both a cup of tea. Minutes later she returned, passing her mother a steaming mug, and sat huddled on the sofa, clutching her own mug of tea with both hands, trying to warm through her frozen fingers. "Go on then," exclaimed Mrs. Henley. "Out with it." "Out with what?" replied Izzy. "Last night. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You are usually so happy and full of life when you break up from school for the Christmas holidays. So what's happened?" "Nothing," Izzy snapped, lowering her head to the mug of still too hot tea, taking a large gulp to try and stop the stinging tears in the back of her eyes overflowing. Mrs. Henley saw the sudden distress on her daughter's face and got up so that she could sit with her on the sofa. "Don't lie to me, Isabel Henley," Mrs. Henley continued. "Is it school? Are you being bullied? Is it the teachers, the work? What?" Izzy gave out a huge sigh. She had to tell her mother. Her parents had been unusually understanding last night when she had come back in, silently eaten her tea and then gone to bed early. They knew that there was something wrong, and if Izzy knew her mother like she did, then she wouldn't stop until she knew what was wrong anyway. So she weighed up silently in her head that she may as well tell her now, rather than have both her mother and father get it out of her later. "Well, it's just that," Izzy started and then stopped. "It's Mr. Brown, you see." Mrs. Henley did not see. Her mind was racing. What on earth had Izzy's teacher done that made her so upset like this? She wanted answers, and she wanted answers now. But she didn't want to rush her daughter either. "Mr. Brown has organised a fancy dress pony parade at the village Christmas fair," Izzy hurriedly told her mother. There, she'd done it. The words were out. Her mother sat at the side of her and let out a long, slow, deep breath. Neither of them had realised before this that Claire Henley had been holding her breath, afraid of the horrors her daughter may have announced Mr. Brown guilty of. "Oh, I see," said her mother, who actually did not see at all. Maybe it was the way she viewed the world through her ageing eyes, but she thought a fancy dress pony parade was actually a good idea. No one to shout and cry over, and Izzy loved horses. Mrs. Henley, unfortunately, did not make the connection between her sad daughter and the fancy dress parade. "So this makes you upset because," she probed. "Because," started Izzy, "it's just something else that I'm excluded from." She hung her head and drank more of the still too hot tea. It was starting to sink in now. It was because her daughter could not take part in the parade, as Claire Henley knew all the other girls Izzy had grown up with would, not the actual parade itself. All the girls were talking about it on the bus on the way home. Pamela has been to lots of family dress parades, and as there are 4 different categories for the Rosettes, she's going to enter all 3 of her ponies. "And what are the categories going to be?" asked her mother, trying to search for things to say that might soothe her daughter and take away the pain of not being able to take part. "Well," started Izzy, imagining in her mind's eye the colourful image of the ponies and riders all lined up on the village main street. "It's going to be 14-2 lead rein, under 14-2 lead rein, under 14-2 mounted, over 14-2 lead rein, and over 14-2 mounted. And I'm guessing Susan and Carol are going to be joining Pamela in the parade?" Mrs. Henley cautiously asked her daughter. "Uh-huh," replied Izzy. She didn't dare speak actual words, as she didn't trust her voice to hold. She could already feel a lump starting to form in her throat, and she was trying desperately to gulp away with her tea. Totally understanding the situation and her daughter's distress now, Mrs. Henley reached out, putting a soothing hand on her daughter's back and said, "Right, I see." And she did. She clearly saw that even though herself and husband worked 16-hour days to make sure their ends meet, it was still not enough to give their daughter the life she so desperately longed for. "You are lucky, you know," her mother tried. Izzy span round to face her. "And how's that, then?" The words sounded more venomous than she had meant, but still, how could she, Isabel Henley, the poorest girl in the whole school, be lucky? Look at all the starving children in Africa. Poverty-stricken youths living in inner-city concrete jungles. Children who grow up with just one parent and not enough money to put food on the plate. In the olden days, children your age were sent off to work away from their homes for months at a time. Pah, stated Izzy, searching for real words but not finding any. Knowing her mother was right about certain things, but surely no 12-year-old had ever been to work on a full-time job. Mrs. Henley finished sternly. Young lady, at times you should take a good look around and think yourself lucky. Now get on with you, finish your tea, get dressed. I'll have your breakfast done for you in a few minutes, and then you can take the dog for a walk. With that, the discussion was over. Izzy knew she was selfish to want more than what her parents could provide, but how could she not want what everybody else had? It did seem unfair, totally unfair. She wasn't in Africa. She wasn't in inner city slums. She was here in Reddock, surrounded by girls who had everything. No, she muttered to herself, it's just not fair at all. After breakfast, she ran into the toilet to put on her wellies and thick winter coat. She put her thumb on the latch and tried with her remaining fingers to pull the door open, but she did not possess the strength her father had used to open the door earlier. Both hands later, and she was still tugging away to no avail, until her brother Jack walked past, still dressed in his pyjamas and dressing gown, and gave it a good tug for her. She was through the door so fast that the mirror only banged once as the door was pulled shut. "Morning to you as well," Jack shouted after her. "Morning," she replied as she ran away from the house, opening the outhouse door as she went and letting out the hugely grateful, bouncing black Labrador dog, Caesar. He wasn't keen on being locked up, as he usually went to work on the farm with Mr. Henley, but today the job was fixing fences in the park where the cows were taken during the day, and as Izzy's father always said to her, dogs and cows don't mix. Caesar was a 4-year-old dog. All the boyish puppy behaviour had left him a couple of years ago, and he'd settled down to being a very well-behaved family pet. He was first bought to be a gun dog for Mr. Henley, as he'd helped out with the estate shoot every year. However, more and more, with the country folk leaving sports like shooting alone, and their places being taken up by townies who wanted to play at being farmers for a day or two, Mr. Henley was starting to want to distance himself from the sport. It brought in good money, but last season he said to his wife, "What's the point in the money? 'Cause when you're arming complete novices who are hell-bent in showing off, it's not going to be long before one of us gets killed, and knowing my luck, that would be me." Now Mr. Henley only went shooting occasionally when the gamekeeper, Mr. Dixon, needed him, so Caesar had become, over the long summer months since last year's shoots, more of a family pet than a working dog. It was still a freezing winter's morning, with the ground under Izzy's feet, and the air cold and fresh in the lungs. She was slowly moving over the ground past Mr. Henley's car to the track that in one direction led to the garden and Mr. Elliott's house, and in the other direction the farm's sort of crossroads. Izzy stood and looked down the track to the gardener's house for a while. She liked the old gardener very much. She often went to help him at his work, listening to tales of old times. His stories of Reddock's past often sent her into daydreams of her own. That was it. Her mind was made up. She was going to do a loop of the farm while walking Caesar, and that meant she would end up at Mr. Elliott's before going home. So she did an about turn and set off in the opposite direction towards the farm. At the end of the track was as close to a crossroads as you can get on a farm. To the left was the main yard, with all of the sheds, barns, cattle stores, and all the other various buildings needed to run a place like that. Straight ahead was a concrete drive leading to the front of Mr. Prest, the farmer's house, and past that the tradesman's entrance to the rear of the hall, and to the right was the main drive. It was this direction that Izzy chose to travel in, and so she started up the slightly gradiented drive out towards the open countryside. Walking up the drive, on her right-hand side, she had the tall, forbidding 10-foot boundary wall which protected Reddock Hall from the outside world, and to her left the familiar lambing field. At the far side of that was her own kitchen window, through which she could see her mother's head bowed as she was washing up the dishes left by her children after their breakfast. Guiltily, Izzy removed her hand from the warmth of her coat pocket and waved out to her mother in an attempt to try and apologise for her behaviour the previous evening, when she'd returned from school so devastated by the thought of the fancy dress pony parade. "Come on, lad," Izzy called out to Caesar, as she widened her stride to put more distance between herself and the guilt she still carried for yelling at her parents. A few strides later, and she'd drawn level with the corner of the coach house to which her home was attached. The door to the rear of the stables was propped open as it led directly into the lambing field. It was usually open so that the lambs could shelter from the weather within its high bricked walls. As she passed, she could clearly make out the 6 individual horse stalls, still intact as if it had only been yesterday since the last horse had left. It was one of Izzy's most favourite places in the whole world. She was in shouting distance of her parents if they needed her, close to the security of her home, but far enough away to be totally independent and not tramped into their tiny cottage. As she walked along, she looked down at her dog, dashing this way and that, trying to snuffle up every last scent that was on the drive before he felt he could move on to the next bit. They quickly came to the end of the boundary wall on their right, which was soon replaced with the thin hedging of trees. During the summer, when all of the leaves were out, you could not see through to the other side, but this time of year, when the branches were naked, you could easily make out the 2 gleaming modern tennis courts at the other side, used by the hall in the summer to help exercise the boarding boys. On the other side of the drive was the main entrance to the coach house, accessed between 2 huge brick gate posts topped with massive concrete spheres at either side. It was clear to see the grandeur in the building, with the large entrance door down to the middle of the main building. Above that, attached to the roof, a clock tower, looking down on the stable yard to one side and to the farmyard to the other, so the estate workers always knew what time it was. If you looked at the coach house on a floor plan, the whole perimeter would be a square. You entered the square from the drive in one corner of the block, and from the gate posts, huge great boundary walls ran down to meet the other corners of the square, which were made up by the stable buildings itself. The downstairs of Izzy House was hidden from where she stood. It was at the other side of the far corner, but if you looked up, at the right-hand side, in the roof were 2 dormer windows. The one furthest into the corner was Izzy's own bedroom window, and the one further along was Jack's. She smiled as she looked up at them while continuing their walk. Letting out a sigh, she realised life wasn't bad all of the time. She did have an amazing view out of her bedroom window, straight down onto this yard, and past the boundary wall through the pergola and into the back sheep's field, which was where Izzy was heading now, still followed by a sniffing, bounding, faithful Labrador. Once past the pergola's thin 40-metre width, Izzy came to the gate that led to the field where the sheep usually lived. The pergola's hedge ran all the way down the right-hand side of the field until the trees and plants ended, but the field carried on and went right around the back of the pergola to the rear of Mr. Elliott's yard. It was a nice opening, the gate, because for most of the year the field contained sheep, so she was not allowed inside. "I won't be picking ticks from the skin of either you or that dog," Mr. Henley would say. "I've got better things to be using my cartridges on than a dog that goes worrying sheep." Izzy knew her father would never shoot Caesar. She knew that Caesar wasn't the least bit interested in Mr. Prest's sheep. But she knew what her father was telling her, and so she only ever brought him out this way in the winter when the sheep were safely tucked into the warm barn. Racing through the field, calling out for Caesar to follow, Izzy was trying to drink in all that was around her. All of the scenery was rigid, bare and harsh. There was no growth yet, and all of the trees and plants had shed their leaves to help protect them from the harsh Yorkshire winter. Now that she was out of sight of the whole estate, Izzy allowed herself to drift into her own world of fancy. She was no longer alone, with just Caesar for company. She was sat astride a magnificent 15 hands high, bright bay show pony all of her own. She sprang about with her arms held aloft as if she was holding the reins of her imaginary show pony. The dead winter trees replaced by row upon row of spectators as Izzy cantered into the main ring. She cantered her imaginary beast around a show jumping course only Izzy in her mind's eye could see, and every now and then she leapt into the air as if she was clearing the very jumps herself. Her collected canter was perfect. She met each jump brilliantly, whether it was a single, double or drop. She was there living the ride as if it was actually happening. After the last double on the course, she turned her imaginary steed across the arena and at full gallop took the large wall jump, and with a turn that would have left most polo ponies envious, she climbed the dreaded Hickstead Hill, popping over the little jump halfway up, and carried on to the very edge, where she stopped her pony, let her put her head down to take in the severity of the almost sheer cliff-face drop she had to go down without making a single motion to step backwards. Leaning fully backwards in her saddle on her imaginary horse, she urged her forward, sitting tight as the watching crowd grasped in their breath, praying that both horse and rider would make it to the bottom safely. But of course they did, and the whole crowd let out an almighty cheer that rang in Izzy's ears. Collecting back in her horse's head with the reins, she surged her forward with her seat over the jump at the bottom of the grass cliff, charging forward to the last spread jump. And that was it. She heard the announcer call out over the microphone, "That was your last rider, Miss Isabel Henley, and her horse Prancer's Dance, and as they were the only ones to jump a clear round, they are today's winners." And the whole crowd got to their feet and waved and clapped as Izzy, on board Prancer's Dance, galloped around the ring doing a final lap of honour, Izzy holding the winning cup high in the air for everyone to see. Suddenly, giggling emanated out of the pergola, wrenching Izzy back into the real world, and she landed back to earth with a sudden bump, sending Caesar crashing into the back of her legs. He'd been thoroughly enjoying himself following Prancer's Dance around the Hickstead course, and he sat back happily with his tongue lolling out of the side of his mouth. Izzy stood deathly still. Had she imagined the giggling? Was it real, or was it part of her Hickstead fantasies? But Izzy already knew the answer to that. She knew it was real, and she blushed with embarrassment at the thought of being watched and laughed at, as she had escaped into a private, perfect show world. Angrily, Izzy stomped over to the hedge, which separated the sheep's field with the pergola. She stopped and listened, crouching down so that she could peer through the hedge where it hadn't grown so thick. On the other side, she saw last summer's long dead grass spring back to place where someone had obviously just disturbed it. "Hello? Hello? Who's there?" Izzy called through the side of the hedge, but of course no one answered. Must be one of Mr. Elliot's grandchildren, she thought. It had sounded like a young girl, and boy maybe, matching perfectly the Elliot's grandchildren, Martha and George. "And they are hardly going to reply, as I know that they are not allowed to play in that wood," Izzy huffed to herself, looking again through the hedge. She turned her gaze up its inner side towards where she knew the old summer house to be. Jack had first discovered the summer house when he was about 8 and Izzy about 5. It had been a rare summer's day that Jack hadn't been sat at his computer killing zombies or playing professional football, when they had set about to go into the pergola with the intention of making a den, but travelling further away from home than they would usually go. From the back of their garden through the trees and plants, they had walked towards the rear of Mr. Elliot's and his secret walled garden, and just happened upon the large wooden circular structure that had once been a grand summer house used by the ladies from Reddock Hall. Izzy's cheeks burned with the knowledge that she'd been spied upon. Anger and mortification attacked her senses all at once, and under her breath she cursed her silliness at having such fancies, as anyone could be watching her at any time, and surely, being 12, it's something she should have grown out of by now. Shouting her dog over, she decided that there was nothing else for it but to continue on her walk, but she was definitely going to mention to Mr. Elliot that they had been there. She would never normally tell tales, but this was different. If they're going to spy on her and run off giggling, then she was going to tell on them for being where they're not supposed to be. With her black mood of bad temper, Izzy did not loop around the farm so that she could come at Mr. Elliott's yard from the rear. Being spied upon had made her feel uneasy. It had put her senses on high alert, so she turned back and walked Caesar across the sheep's field, which had not long ago been the vibrant and exciting main show ring at Hickstead. She went through the gate, back down the drive to the crossroads, and left onto the track that led to Mr. Elliott's house. The track straight ahead up the large galvanised 5-bar gate, which was the main way to Mr. Elliott's yard. To the left of the gate stood the gardener's house, tall and very well built, with detailed brickwork and a large apex to the front, which had an ornate wooden board pinned to the underneath of where the roof tiles finished. Izzy always thought that these wooden boards reminded her of the fringes of fancy doilies her grandma used when she wanted to put a vase of flowers on a polished wooden surface. Behind the house, but out of view from where Izzy stood, was Mr. Elliott's walled secret garden. Only it wasn't very secret, as Izzy had been inside lots of times. It was where Mr. and Mrs. Elliott grew various fruits, vegetables and flowers, and it had been at the rear of this, through the trees, where Izzy had seen the grandchildren disappear off to after they had finished spying, the memory of which sent a cold shiver of goose over grave straight down Izzy's spine, and she marched on more determinedly towards the gardener's house. To the right side of Mr. Elliott's gate, stretched out lengthways to the track, were 4 very long, almost industrial-sized greenhouses, where the old gardener grew most of his fruit. His pride and joy was the furthest greenhouse, which grew within its paned sides and roof the Reddock vine, a huge grapevine which every year the old gardener harvested and made a special wine, which he also bottled and sold at the local village shop. In the olden days, when they had first come to live on the estate, Mr. Elliott had been employed as the main estate gardener. Not only did he look after the formal grounds to the hall, but he also provided fresh fruit, vegetables and flowers for old Mr. Foster, who was the last one in generations of his family to inhabit Reddock Hall. Mrs. Elliott had been the housekeeper for Mr. Foster, and she used to present the old squire with all the fresh produce created by her husband's labour. She herself dabbled with the growing of very rare and expensive flowers for the garden room to the rear of the hall, which Mr. Foster's favourite place to read his morning paper. In the 10 years Izzy had lived on the Reddock estate, she had heard many tales from the old gardener about the old hall and its ancient occupant, but even though he still worked there now, just cutting the grass and keeping the place tidy, he never spoke about it with any zest at all. He had once said to her, "Cruel, if you ask me." No one had asked him anything, but he continued all the same. "Don't know why folks have little ones if all they want to do is lock 'em up for half their lives." Izzy didn't say anything, but she wholeheartedly agreed with the old gardener. To her, the old hall had always just been a glorified and expensive prison.